Hi, folks. We're Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about what I think is one of the interesting facets of history: how often rulers and kings and monarchs have pursued the notion that they can achieve and gain a decisive battle victory. The one battle that'll vanquish the enemy, kick ass left, right, and center, and will take control of the other guys' lands and so on. This is it. This is the one. And how often this is pursued. And what's even more interesting still is how rarely this is achieved. So throughout history, you've got very few examples of success in that arena, seeking out the all-encompassing, totally decisive battle on the battlefield, the one battle, the one day. And given that mostly these battles were, they start, this is in summertime, especially in Northern Europe, they'd kick off around 10, 11 in the morning, and they'd maybe go till 9 or 10 at night, so, or up to that. So typically it was somewhere between 4 and 12 hours the thing would last. But again, that totally decisive, absolute total victory type battle. Now, throughout history, it hardly ever happened. A few times. But still, this was what monarchs and rulers pursued. Now, given how rarely it happened throughout history, this decisive battle, why were they constantly looking for this? Well, a number of reasons for it. Fighting wars is really expensive, so there was always the wishful thinking and the optimistic view of, if we have a big victory here, the other guy may throw in the towel, might give up, and then we've achieved victory, sort of a form of moral victory that follows on from a single battlefield victory. Or that the enemy would be in worse shape, the other guy being worse shape than you, so that if their army was largely destroyed on the battlefield, then firstly, it'd be very expensive for them to train and put together another army. But secondly, a lot of the aristocrats that the king nominally reported into the king, they would say, hey, look, I lost a lot of men there. It's costing me a fortune. I don't really want to do this. You need to cut a deal with those guys, and let's finish the war and let's finish the fighting and so on. So there are a number of political behind the scenes pressures that could be brought to bear to the losing side, and that happens sometimes. But that decisive battle, now three things need to be in place if you're going to go for the decisive battle. Well, one is you need to have the better military by a decent amount. It's no good having a slugfest that lasts all day where the other guy loses a few more dudes than you do, but there's no crushing victory or anything like that. It was a close run thing, and you got the better of it, but only just. We could use examples throughout history of this. For example, Napoleon in the Battle of Borodino, as his grand army is approaching Moscow. Napoleon won, but it's kind of a draw because the Russians decided they'd vacate the battlefield rather than have another battle. So there was a kind of a moral sort of victory for Napoleon. But the reality is that both sides had very similar losses. Both sides were pretty beat up by the whole thing. So there was no great crushing victory on one side or the other. And the Russians survived to sort of fight another day. Now, you can look at battles throughout history. The Battle of Gettysburg is a good example of this. This was where the Union successfully frustrated the Confederates' objectives. So the Confederates were trying to achieve certain objectives. They needed to achieve those objectives. They were running out of resources much quicker than the Union was. And so to merely prevent the Confederates from winning was, in essence, a substantial victory in the overall scheme of things, given the relative manpower and relative resources. But it was no great battlefield victory, but it did frustrate the enemy's intentions and ambitions. So having the best military is one key to seeking out and having any sort of confidence in achieving a decisive battle. The next thing is resources. What if you don't win a crushing victory or a convincing victory or any sort of decisive outcome on that day? What do you do? That means there's going to be follow-up battles. You've got to keep your army in the field. because in the course of just winning the first battle by a small margin, or even losing it by a small margin, your guys are pretty beat up anyway. You've got to get reinforcements in. There's got to be more equipment. You've got to feed these guys. You've got to provide transport, all very expensive, big logistical machines required. You're going to have to tax your subjects more heavily. They're going to get upset by that. So there's a whole lot of what are your resources? If you can apply the taxes and you've got a wealthy sort of wealthy country there, a wealthy nation state or whatever, then you can apply relatively modest taxes, which aren't going to annoy too many people, and that'll bring in enough revenue to be able to keep the army going and keep the war going. But if you don't have that sort of latitude in resources, then the chances are you can't sustain any lengthy fight. So you're going to have to come to terms with the other guy regardless. This was often the case in European wars, such as the 100 Years' War, the 30 Years' War, and most of the other wars of that sort of early medieval to even up to the Napoleonic War stage. It was frequently exhaustion in terms of the financial resources to continue the fight that caused the sides to come to the peace table. But often it was only a breather while they gathered breath or drew breath for the next part of the wider conflict. So resources are very important. Now, if the other guy knows you've got a lot of resources, even if the first battle was a marginal win or loss, if they know you've got the most resources and they know they can't achieve a decisive battlefield victory, then they're not going to want to draw it out, because they're just going to suffer a lot of losses and financial hardship for no obvious or clear material gain. So this again would bring them to the negotiating table. The third thing is to achieve or gain a degree or element of legitimacy, so that the people, the folks you've just defeated, accept that okay, all right, then you're better at this than we are. You've got a more efficient army. You've got more resources. Given the amount of trade you guys do, it may even pay us to become part of your little empire. So and then the conqueror gives key positions in the lets the existing nobility keep their positions of prestige and privilege and this sort of thing. And so they're able to gain a high degree of legitimacy, because if you don't achieve legitimacy, the minute your power starts to wane, the other guys will try and kick you out. They never accepted your supremacy in the area. They did it grudgingly and with much annoyance and regret. And so the minute that you weaken, then they're more than keen to kick you out and reestablish or reassert their previous independence. So if wars and battles are going to achieve, they need three. You need the superior military, you need the bigger resources, and you need to again achieve at least a degree of legitimacy that most people are prepared to accept. Even where legitimacy is accepted, there are still going to be pinings for independence and return to the days. Even if it's centuries later, they still do it. It can still happen. So let's have a look at the few. Now, the Romans, for the most part, during the days of the Roman Empire, the Romans had, for the most part, the better army, but by better equipped, better organized, better logistical machine. They were better fed, better led, better generals, and so on. And they also had vast resources. You could wipe out, as the Carthaginians found, you could wipe out 3 or 4 large Roman armies in total. You could, easily inflict 150,000, 200,000 casualties on the Romans, but they still possessed the depth of manpower and the resources to fight on. The Battle of Cannae was a classic case in point. The Carthaginians managed to capture something in the order of 80,000 swords and shields and bits of armor and spears and so on. So a vast cache of weaponry that would bankrupt anything other than a very wealthy nation. and the Romans were able to replace that within 12 months. Everything that was lost to Cannae, a crushing victory to Carthaginians. In fact, it didn't even take 12 months for the Romans to replace it. Such was the depth of manpower and resources they possessed. So these are very vital things. Now, if it's just one bunch of dudes against another, that's one thing. But war typically draws in coalitions, and the resources of the entire coalition can come into play here. So if you manage to defeat one of the members of the coalition, there's no total victories anywhere near in sight. What's going to happen is you then have to fight all the others. Now, there have been very few generals that have even been, successful battle to battle. Napoleon Bonaparte was one where the French army and Napoleon's generalship in particular was so far ahead of all the other combatants that Napoleon was able to achieve, one decisive victory after another. There could be Austerlitz, Battle of Jena, and others that many Napoleon achieved, and he was able to inflict crushing defeats on the enemy for fairly, not minor, but over the entire period of the Napoleonic Wars, something like 2 million French soldiers died. So it was hardly at no cost. But Napoleon was able to achieve decisive victories. But most of the time, the victory was the peace terms that were imposed were done with much resentment and annoyance and irritation to the other side. So the minute they thought they could do it, they would reopen hostilities, and then the whole thing would begin again. The sort of peace terms Napoleon imposed were, on reflection, probably guaranteed to build that resentment. Try as he might in some instances to smooth it over, it didn't really work. But again, even though Napoleon was achieving these victories, the coalitions against him, bankrolled often by Britain, was such that the victories were never enough. They were never considered legitimate. The win was never considered legitimate. Napoleon's his emperorship or first consul as he was originally in France, that was never seen as legitimate. His administration wasn't seen as legitimate. The peace that was imposed was not legitimate. The billeting of large numbers of French troops in foreign other countries, that wasn't legitimate. So Napoleon completely failed on the legitimacy side. Not that he didn't make some efforts, but because of that failure, then all the victories that he won. And again, Napoleon was often fighting foes that collectively had vastly more resources than France did, but still Napoleon was winning victories because of the quality of the military, and that it took time for those resources in the coalitions against him. It took time for those resources to actually begin to impact directly onto the battlefield. And typically, the side with the most resources is able to fight a war of attrition that the guys with the least resources can't fight. So if the war does drag on, there's a lack of clear and decisive victories, then the victory will go to the side with the greatest resources, typically. Now, this was the case even in the medieval times when the Spanish Habsburgs, funded by all the gold and silver they were getting out of South America, they were attempting to control Europe, put down the Protestant uprisings, all this sort of stuff. And instead of them making Spain, because that was the center of the Holy Roman Habsburg sort of empire for a while during the time of Charles, anyway, this idea was that the Spanish would put the Spanish king and the Holy Roman Emperor would put all the resources they had into really fighting a Catholic war, I guess you could say, and subduing Europe, and with some degree of success or intermittent success. And they had some good generals like Tilly and Wallenstein and so on. The Duke de Parma, I think it was another general. But all the resources they had were being put into this rather than creating a productive, efficient economy in Spain. So when they started to run out of the South American gold and silver, then they couldn't afford the wars anymore. When the wars were costing more than than they were bringing in income from the South American colonies. So they were able to bankrupt themselves and still not achieve anything. And the main reason for that is as they started to throw their weight around and play bully boy on the European stage, the other people, the other countries around the place got concerned by this, didn't like the thuggery, and so they formed these grand coalitions, which in aggregate had more resources than the Spanish Habsburg Empire had. And so, given they couldn't achieve a total and decisive battlefield victory, and many of the battles that they won, the victor had only slightly fewer casualties than the vanquished. So, and typically a great victory on the battlefield means that you're in good enough shape at the end of the main part of the battle to send the cavalry and so on in a chase after the enemy as they're trying to retreat from the battlefield. In that way, you're able to gather in lots of other prisoners, cut to pieces those who still want to fight, but also you're able to get all the baggage and the weaponry and so on. So therefore, you increase the cost manyfold that it would be to replenish and rearm and restock the army and put reinforcements into it and so on. But most of the time they couldn't engage in that pursuit because they were so beat up, even though the other guys again had vacated the battlefield. Most of their battles were close run affairs. There might have been a declared victor, but they were nonetheless close run affairs. Often the battles were achieved through a direct frontal assault on a key part of the battle line, taking heavy casualties in the process, but the opposing army would be split in two and their flanks exposed. So on that basis, they would be obliged to retreat from the battlefield, if anything, to prevent a military disaster. But they were typically leaving the battlefield, retreating from the battlefield after having sustained not that much in the way of losses. The first battle of the Bull Run, for example, in the American Civil War, the losses on the day were less than 1,000, even though it was supposedly a pitched battle. So just coming back to this idea of seeking out decisive battle, it's achieved rarely. If we look at the Wehrmacht assault on the British and French armies in 1940, that was a stunning victory, one of the great military victories of history, and that was a decisive battle. But the resources of those that would oppose them, oppose the Nazis at the time, the United States, Britain, and then the Soviet Union, the collective resources of those other combatants were vastly greater than anything that Germany could command at the time. And in addition, even the only way the Nazis could stay in the game for as long as they did was because their army was so efficient. And we can see this in World War I as well. The German army in World War I was inflicting 1.6 casualties against every one they received. And this was the case even against first-rate British and French army. The Germans were still decidedly superior in tactics, training, leadership, and so on. So they could stay in the game much longer than their resources would suggest, just because they were militarily so superior. Similarly, in their industrial base, even though Britain and France combined had a larger industrial base than Germany, the quality of the German manufacturers, the interchangeability of parts, the better technical support in the field, the better maintenance, and remachining of parts, all that sort of stuff. The Germans were well ahead. Quality of the metallurgy, Germans were well ahead of the British and the French, which meant again they could really punch above their weight when it came to resources. So those factors are the ones that typically affect not only the ability to seek out decisive battle, but whether that decisive battle is sufficient to decide the outcome of the war, whether it's just a battle within the war. For example, the many victories that Napoleon Bonaparte was able to achieve, probably one of the greatest generals of all time, in spite of those many victories, some of them very decisive, he still was not able to win the overall war, given the range of forces against him and the amount of resources that those other armies and nations possessed. That in the end, their resources is what decided finally the outcome of those Napoleonic Wars. So in summary, the seeking out of decisive battlefield victory to decide a war very rarely happens. And again, it needs that military superiority that the Romans had. It needs the superiority in resources, and it also needs, again, the ability to achieve at least an element of legitimacy in the outcome. For example, invading the other country. Now, a lot of these other places accepted Roman rule or Roman overlordship or whatever you want to call it. And so the Romans, on a relative basis compared to, if you look at the span of history, the Romans were able to establish a degree of legitimacy that was quite rare in conquering armies, but they were able to achieve it. And again, when you look at the technology the Romans brought, you look at a Roman aqueduct and so on and so you look at and anybody would, back in those days, still today, you would look at that in absolute awe. So Roman engineering and Roman technology was such that these guys go, wow. And when they the Romans captured tribal chieftains like British chieftains, and they would bring them to Rome as like to put them on show as a conquered leader and all that sort of stuff. These people would come, they'd walk around Rome, because remember, most of these people came from mud huts or stone huts with thatched roofs and this sort of thing. They had nothing like the Colosseum or the aqueducts or anything like that in the places they came from. Certainly nothing like the scale that the Romans had. And so they would come to Rome, and they'd be, some of them, they're tribal chieftains, so they weren't necessarily in prison, and they would walk around the downtown of Rome, and they would ask, why are you bothering to conquer our countries? Look, you've got the most incredible technology and capability here. Why are you bothered with us? We're just some backwater in the middle of nowhere. And these tribal chieftains didn't necessarily understand that the Romans were maybe they were after certain raw materials such as tin. They wanted to get tin out of England, or there were certain ores or metals or lead, or it didn't matter. The Romans needed those raw materials to grow and to further their empire, and that was beyond the comprehension of some of these people. But nonetheless, the Romans were one of the few empires. The British Empire was another one of the few empires that were able to achieve that level of legitimacy, and thus the longevity of their empire, which of course spanned many hundreds of years. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.